Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ralph Stefan Weir to discuss dualism, physicalism, the mind-body problem, and everything in between. Ralph is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Lincoln. I've put links to his work in the description, so please check that out. He's got a really good book with Routledge that I highly recommend. Thanks for joining me, Ralph, and how about we dig right into the presentation?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of my ideas about the philosophy of mind. When we were chit-chatting about what we might include in this discussion, we touched on a few things I'm really interested in, and I've taken the maybe hubristic approach of trying to cover them all. I'm going to start off by explaining why I find this so interesting and important in the first place. Well, I'll try to cover like three really central ideas I accept about the mind-body problem and its consequences for human nature. We'll see if we get through it all. So I think it's fair to say there's a really interesting puzzle just about the history of ideas with which philosophy intersects, or philosophy of mind intersects. And it's something like this. For most of history, people, philosophers and scientists included, repeatedly revert to what can today seem as a really odd idea, which is the idea that humans at least, and perhaps other animals, have immaterial minds that are independent of our bodies, that could exist in the absence of our bodies, conceivably, but which interact with our bodies. Really common idea in the history of Western philosophy, totally standard idea in the history of non-Western philosophy as well. In my book, I give some examples of that. I find in the Indian philosophical tradition particularly rich on this topic. Then, in the mid-20th century, at least kind of elite intellectual culture in developed countries comes to see this idea of an immaterial mind, independent from the body, interacting with the body, comes to see it as profoundly mistaken. And like most people, probably almost anyone who's done like an undergraduate class in philosophy of mind will know this is an idea that is frequently like dismissed out of hand as beyond the pale of reasonable, scientifically informed reflection on human nature. So there's a kind of puzzle here. We naturally ask ourselves, like, why was this idea so popular historically if it was so completely wrong? And were those in the sort of mid-20th century who rejected this idea so determinedly justified in doing so? And it seems as though like there's a tension between thinking they were justified and yet the idea was so popular historically. There are lots of ways in which I think that tension figures when people end up talking about this in the context of history of ideas, but I won't go into that now. Now, so there's a puzzle that I'm really interested in, but you might not instantaneously be interested in this puzzle, so I'll say something about why we might care about it. The first reason is just that for any great shift in people's thinking in intellectual culture, accounting for why it happened, whether it was justified, and if so, what accounts for the mistaken view that preceded that shift is going to tell us a lot about ourselves, either about human nature or human culture or something like that. Most people find us interesting because we're, kind of vain as a species like that, I guess. Furthermore, I find this topic interesting because I think that traditional old view, I'm going to call it dualism. I actually think I could be a little misleading because there are idealists too. We'll touch on that later maybe. But what's often called the dualist view, that there's this immaterial mind in addition to the body, is in many respects much more reasonable than is usually recognized. And I think that the rejection of that view in the middle of the 20th century has been much more intellectually slipshod than is usually recognized. Furthermore, I think seeing how plausible, at least in certain respects, that old view about human nature is, even if it is in fact mistaken, is pivotal to understanding ourselves, understanding many of our values, to recognize human beings as beings of whom it is for them very plausible that they have immaterial minds or souls distinct from their bodies is really crucial for thinking about one another socially, ethically. I think it enters into all of the things that make life worthwhile and significant, even if mistaken. And then further, I think seeing how hasty the rejection of that old view has been, even if the rejection is ultimately the right move, is really important for understanding our recent intellectual culture. I'm not going to have time to draw out I've tried to pack in a lot to this presentation. We won't have time to draw out all of the ways in which the conclusions I want to argue for are significant for our self-understanding, our understanding of our recent intellectual culture, but maybe we'll get to touch on some of this. So here's what I'm going to try and get through. 3 parts to the talk. Part 1 is why one might not find the contemporary predominant materialist view, according to which we're just material bodies, convincing even today. And I'm just going to present as clearly as I can the version of a pretty standard argument against materialism that I find most convincing. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why I think those who accept that kind of argument against materialism, but nonetheless try to avoid going all the way back to like a traditional immaterial mind, something that looks like a Cartesian or Platonic soul, are incapable of coherently doing so. Why I think if you accept the standard kinds of argument for not being a materialist about the mind, you end up more or less inevitably getting a picture that looks quite a lot like the traditional Platonic or Cartesian, or on my interpretation, we won't go into this now, Aristotelian, Thomist, Samkhya, Vaisheshika, mind-body dualism. And then thirdly, I'm going to ask, okay, let's suppose it's true that it's much harder to avoid that traditional mind-body dualism than people have often supposed. How bad is that news? Is it the case that nonetheless we absolutely have to avoid that view? And for the standard reason for thinking, yes, we must, is this argument known as the causal closure argument. I know, Joe, you had certainly who I regard as the most perspicacious and illuminating proponent of that argument, David Papineau, on the podcast not long ago presenting it. I'm going to say something about why I think that's a really elegant, powerful argument in certain respects, but why I think it depends on one very crucial premise, which is, insufficiently supported. I considered saying it's the worst supported premise in the whole history of philosophy. I think that would be a slight exaggeration, but I really do think the support for that premise isn't so great. So the conclusion I'll draw, if we get through all this, is that that old conception of the conscious mind as an immaterial substance, we'll come to what the word substance means, is actually very natural. The official reason for rejecting that idea is, well, I've put on the slide scientifically ignorant. Maybe I would say rather that it is overconfidence in what science, in particular neuroscience, tells us about the nature of the brain, the nervous system. And who knows, maybe we'll be able to discuss some of the consequences of this stuff for intellectual culture or self-understanding, etc. There was almost going to be a section 4, by the way, about deep history and the emergence of the central nervous system in Urbilateria, the first being posited as having a central nervous system. I've decided we better not get onto that now, but maybe I could come back and talk about it sometime. So part 1, the conceptual, what I'm going to call here the conceptual argument for dualism or against materialism, or for the view that the conscious mind is immaterial. What do we mean by the conscious mind? Well, it's intuitively the case that in addition to our physical properties, our shape, size, our more complex physiological processes like respiration and digestion, we humans seem to have mental properties like conscious experience, intentionality, the ability to have thoughts that are about things in our environment, reason, the ability to follow rational arguments, agency, perhaps the ability to make free choices that are based on our deliberations rather than our mere causal histories. And that I see as like the motivation for the mind-body problem in the first place. We seem to have these two really different kinds of properties, physical properties that we share with other physical objects, mental properties that seem to be unique to us and some limited number of other creatures, maybe bilateria onwards or something like that. It's hard to say. And a lot of what I'm going to say and what follows, I actually think applies to our mental nature generally. But I'm going to focus on one of these mental characteristics in particular, that being consciousness, partly because I think it is particularly interesting, but also partly because this is where the discussion has centered. So if we want to think about where intellectual history has gotten to and where it is headed or ought to be headed, that makes sense to be our focus. So consciousness, once again, we need to clarify the term a bit. It will come as no surprise to people familiar with these discussions that by consciousness, I mean what is sometimes distinguished as phenomenal consciousness, as distinct from mere functional consciousness. So functional consciousness is a term that gets applied to any functional capacity as defined by inputs and outputs, such as, for example, being able to respond to one's environment in an adaptive manner. Phenomenal consciousness, by contrast, is usually defined by reference to Thomas Nagel's classic article, What It's Like to Be a Bat, where he talks about the fact that in addition to everything we can see about a bat from the outside, everything we can measure using our scientific instruments, presumably there is something it is like to be the bat from the inside. Well, that world, that internal phenomenological space is what we're talking about when we're talking about phenomenal consciousness. I also think it's useful to, again, to try and narrow the focus or get the focus clear. It's useful to think of phenomenal consciousness as the referent of direct phenomenal concepts. This is a notion used by people like David Chalmers and Philip Goff, where a direct phenomenal concept is the concept one acquires of a kind of experience by attending to that experience. So, for example, if I'm staring at a red wall and I look at it and I ostend inwardly at it and say to myself, this is what a qualitative or visual redness is like. I can then, call it to mind again, think about it. I would be making use of a direct phenomenal concept in that case. Another way to think about this is that in the classic thought experiment of Mary, the scientist who knows everything there is to know about the physiology of visual experience, but has never seen colored objects because she's trapped in a black and white room for some reason, Mary has concepts. She has concepts of colors as those things that excite certain nerve cells and lead to certain neurological processes. But she seems to lack the direct phenomenal concepts of colors that we acquire by actually seeing colors. Now, of course, it could turn out that the direct phenomenal concepts refer to something that Mary's concepts refer to too. That's what a materialist thinks. But insofar as we're identifying the subject matter, it's useful to think of phenomenal consciousness as conceived under direct phenomenal concepts. Okay, and I've got a picture on the slide there of Ernst Mach's famous self-portrait, the physicist. Most people's self-portraits, it looks a bit like they do in a mirror. Mach does this clever thing and draws himself as he appears to himself from the inside. So you can kind of see his nose at one side, a bit of a moustache, his legs out in front of him. Some people think that's a profound representation of the perspective from which we get the idea of phenomenal consciousness. I think you get the same profound representation of that in classic shooter games like ID Software's Doom, where once again, the reason Doom looks like that is because, as it seems, in addition to all the external physical properties that you can observe from the outside of a human being, there's also this phenomenological interiority. And the mind-body problem as it applies to consciousness is the problem of explaining what is the relationship between those two. So there are various arguments about this, and there are some arguments for thinking that the conscious mind, where we mean the mind insofar as it consists in these phenomenal states that we're aware of from the inside, is not physical. It's something in addition to the physical world, at least insofar as it involves properties that do not belong to the physical world. And I've got on the slide here what I've named for current purposes the conceptual argument for the immateriality of the conscious mind. This is just like my way of putting what is also called the conceivability argument, or sometimes the zombie argument against materialism about the conscious mind. I kind of prefer conceptual, because when you use conceivability, people start thinking about imagining, and I don't think imagining is all that relevant to the core of this argument. So here's how the argument goes. Premise one, it's not a conceptual truth, and I'll say what I mean by that. It's not a conceptual truth that the physical facts about the world necessitate the phenomenal facts. Premise two, if it's not a conceptual truth that the physical facts about the world necessitate the phenomenal facts, then the physical facts do not necessitate the phenomenal facts. Conclusion, therefore, the physical facts do not necessitate the phenomenal facts. Most people would agree, if that's right, if the physical facts about, for example, my brain, my nervous system, my body, my physical environment don't necessitate the existence of my conscious mind, then my conscious mind is something extra, or at least involves properties in addition to those of my physical body. All right, so we've got a simple argument here. It has two premises. I'm going to say briefly on one slide why we should accept premise one, and then I'm going to say less briefly, but perhaps still not at sufficient length over the next 5 or 6 slides, why we should accept premise two. So premise one, it says, it is not a conceptual truth that the physical facts necessitate the phenomenal facts. What do I mean by a conceptual truth here? I just mean a truth that can be known by anyone who has understood it. I'll say more about that over the next 5 slides. Now, why should we accept it's not a conceptual truth that the physical facts necessitate the phenomenal facts? Well, it's useful and standard in this context to introduce the idea of a philosophical zombie, or of a philosophical zombie world. A philosophical zombie, unlike a Hollywood zombie, is a physical duplicate, a precise, exact physical duplicate. Every particle, if there really exist particles, or every physical component in the same place, operating in the same way, a perfect physical duplicate of a real human being, except without their conscious experience, except that it's all dark on the inside. Kind of a perfect human puppet or automaton made out of the very same cells as we are, but without the light of consciousness. A zombie world, and for certain technical reasons, people often like to put the argument in terms of an entire world, would be a physical duplicate of the entire world without any conscious experience, a world just like ours, except there's no light of consciousness on the inside of anyone's mind. For certain technical reasons, people will clarify that they have in mind a minimal physical duplicate of the actual world. That means a physical duplicate without anything extra added. Well, call that a zombie world. It looks to most people like we can't see, just by thinking about it, that such a world is impossible. Such a world is bizarre. We can be pretty sure, or most of us feel we're pretty sure, there aren't philosophical zombies in the actual world. But there doesn't seem to be anything incoherent in the idea that you could have a world just like ours, with all those physical particles or fields interacting in just the same ways, and yet no light of consciousness on the inside, just an automatic, mechanistic world of particles and fields. Okay, some people actually think that's what our world is in some sense, but we'll come to that. This is widely agreed, and that's why one of the reasons I'm not going to spend too much time on this premise. Again, when people talk about it, they often refer to the Great Phil Papers survey by Bourget and Chalmers, which shows that of those philosophers with an opinion on this question, a majority of them do think that this zombie world is conceptually coherent. We can't rule out its possibility just by thinking about it. And in fact, I would suggest that those who reject the coherence, the conceptual coherence of this world, are typically, I would actually say, almost by definition, always just refusing to use the word consciousness for phenomenal consciousness, refusing to evaluate what they're being asked to evaluate. Sometimes this happens in philosophical discussions awkwardly.
I mean, I think this kind of epistemic gap between the physical domain and the phenomenal domain it's very hard for me to deny, because it's like, I mean, there's explanatory gap arguments where it's like, well, given all the physical facts in question, we can specify down to every minute physical detail, the position, the momentum, the charge, the mass, the spin of all the particles in a brain, for instance. You can look at the large scale structure and dynamics of brains and whatnot in purely physical, biological, chemical, neurophysiological terms. You can give me all that sort of information, and it still seems to me that there's this question. I still am puzzled. But why? Why is there anything that it's like to be in that state, right? And like, why does that feel the way it does? And if there is that further question, like if I can still be intelligibly puzzled at that, then it doesn't just sort of conceptually fall out of the structure and dynamics in question, characterized purely physically, or the phenomenal truths don't sort of fall out of those things. So conceptually speaking, so like, I don't know, like the very fact that, I don't know, at least seems that I and tons of other people can intelligibly even ask this question, that we can wonder about it, indicates that there's an epistemic gap.
I think that's really helpful. And for people who want to say there isn't really this gap, like the big project then is to explain why it seems so clearly to so many of us like there is such a gap. I don't hold out much hope for a really, really satisfactory explanation of that sort. For this reason, most of the attention, most of the pressure goes on premise 2 of this argument, or equivalence of premise 2 of the argument, as I've put it. So as I've expressed it, that premise says if it is not a conceptual truth, that the physical facts necessitate the phenomenal facts, then the physical facts do not necessitate the phenomenal facts. Now, this premise is super controversial because a lot of people see it and think, well, hang on a moment, isn't this confusing epistemology with metaphysics? Isn't this assuming we have some kind of mystical or a priori insight into the very nature of reality, which, yeah, maybe we do, but we need to be given some kind of argument we have that kind of insight, or it's at least debatable whether we could have such an insight. And now, there have been various ways in which this second premise or versions of it have been defended. I think it's fair to say that the 2 most influential have been an approach loosely referred to as the 2-dimensional semantic approach developed by David Chalmers, Frank Jackson, and others. And then there's an approach we can refer to as the transparent concepts approach developed by Philip Goff and Martina Niederrumelin. I think both of these approaches I think that they are in important respects equivalent, and both get at what is mistaken about thinking that there could be a mere conceptual gap, but no metaphysical gap between the physical world and consciousness, even though we know there can be conceptual gaps where there are no metaphysical gaps of a certain kind. However, I'm inclined to say that the existing presentations of this reasoning tend to involve a degree of complexity which, though interesting and valuable in its own right, is unnecessary to see the crucial point. So I'm going to try to state what I see as the the really crucial observations that make this argument so hard to get around. And the really important thing, I think, that one needs to recognize to see the force of this premise is that meanings, at least the meaning of names, predicates, and derivatively sentences, can be represented, at least in part, as what have come to be known as intentions with a letter S, where an intention, the intention of a term, is the function from a possible world to its extension. This is already like kind of complex, and I have a feeling that one reason why this kind of argument, unlike the Mary argument, doesn't tend to play so well to like a non-professional audience is that to understand it clearly, you kind of have to understand some fairly complex, but nonetheless more or less unavoidable, in my opinion, semantic theory. But it's not that complex. The point here is that, for example, the meaning of the word triangle is, at least in part, representable as the function that takes you from any possible circumstance to the items in that circumstance that are triangular. So you know, this is to say that the word triangle refers to triangles in any possible circumstance you might apply it. Now, that's a pretty standard idea. And then in the case of sentences as opposed to referring terms, the meaning of a sentence, like there is a triangle on this slide, is a function from any given circumstance where there's, you know, it's clear which slide is being ostended, to the truth or falsehood of that sentence. Now, okay, intentional semantics of that sort, maybe that will lose some people already, but if you do linguistics, if you do philosophy, you've probably met this, you're probably quite familiar with this. It's become very standard since the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah, and just to clarify, you're not meaning to claim that this is all that there is to the meaning of a sentence or a predicate or what have you. Instead, your claim is simply that whatever else is part of the meaning of a predicate or concept or sentence, this is part of it.
Yeah, or even if I was being more cautious, I'd say at least part of it can usefully be represented as a function from a possible world to an extension. I think that's like the one only needs that really minimal claim. There's some great literature on like what more there might be to the meaning of terms, hyper-intentional content and so forth. And I'm personally like on board with that. I find it interesting and plausible. Now, but once we make that seemingly pretty minimal, innocent semantic assumption, it follows that insofar as understanding the meaning of a term is understanding its intention, whether it's a predicate, name, a sentence, it seems to follow that you only fully understand a term insofar as you can correctly identify its extension in different possible scenarios. Right? What it is to understand a function from possible scenarios to extensions is to be able to correctly identify what the extension is in different possible scenarios. So to give an example, someone who could not identify anything on this slide as falling within the extension of the word triangle, or if we want to avoid some hair-splitting picture of a red triangle, right? So to that extent, we would think, okay, they haven't understood this word. They haven't understood what this word means. And likewise, for any possible scenario that we could describe, they might misunderstand our description of the scenario, or they might misunderstand the word. But if they've understood both, they need to be able to identify the extension of the term within that scenario. I'm gonna add some important caveats to that in a moment. I don't want the listener to think that I'm sneaking in some kind of synthetic a priori knowledge or anything tricksy here. But it should be pointed out that intentional semantics, so described, so far, it's very, very standard. And it follows trivially from it that anyone who fully understands a sentence expressing a necessary proposition is in a position to see that the proposition is necessary. It would not make sense to say of someone, they have fully understood the function from possible worlds to extensions, and yet they are incapable of recognizing some of the extensions at certain possible worlds. Right? That these would be just equivalent. It would be equivalent to a failure in fully understanding the intention to not be able to see that the necessary truth is a necessary truth. It's okay, we're not going like crazy rationalists here, because we might often be in that position of not fully understanding the intention. But one way of expressing that point is to say there is an important sense in which a posteriori necessary propositions are impossible. It's just a contradiction in terms to say there's an a posteriori necessary proposition. If that means a proposition that you fully understood and you can't see its modal status, its necessity, and hence its truth. Now, if that much is right, then if it is a necessary truth that a minimal physical duplicate of the world, the actual world, contains consciousness, is a phenomenal duplicate of the world, contains all the conscious experiences we're all having, then we should be able to see that this is a necessary truth, at least insofar as our understanding of this proposition isn't flawed in some relevant way. And that's a really important caveat. And that's actually where a lot of people would like to kind of get a crowbar into this argument. Now, anyone who's done a bit of philosophy of language, contemporary metaphysics will want to say, well, hang on a moment. Don't we know that there are a posteriori necessities? For example, that water is H2O. So since at least Saul Kripke's great book, Naming Necessity, I think originally lectures in about 1970 and then published as a book, maybe a decade later. Since then, it's been widely, and some work by Hilary Putnam as well, maybe comparably influential, it's been widely accepted that there are certain kinds of truth which are necessarily true. They're true in any possible world, and yet they can't be seen to be true a posteriori. And the classic examples include identity claims using different names. So going back to the example given by Frege, famously, Hesperus is Phosphorus, the evening star is the morning star, and yet presumably at some time in humanity's past, it wasn't possible to see just by thinking about it that the evening star was the morning star. And yet once you learn, well, the evening star just is Venus and the morning star just is Venus, well, in that case, in any world in which the evening star exists, the morning star must exist too, because it's the same thing. The standard example concerning natural kinds is that water is H2O. Seems as though you can understand the meaning of the claim that water is H2O without being sure whether this is the case. Indeed, people understood the word water presumably for a long time before they had the possibility of knowing just by thinking about it that water was H2O, because they hadn't done enough chemistry to be able to conceive of the molecular structure of H2O. Now, I want to say, like, everyone accepts this. Well, does everyone? Basically, everyone accepts this, and it's exactly right. However, it is pretty clear that a Kripke style, as I'll call them, a Kripke style a posteriori necessity, like water is H2O, is a posteriori necessary only insofar as the term water has been adopted to play a peculiar kind of function. The term water has been adopted, roughly speaking, to refer to the presumed underlying essence, in some appropriate conception of essence, of something we encounter in everyday life whose essence we take ourselves not to know. Right? To put it in other words, we have various words where, as a matter, it would seem, of convention, perhaps sometimes of stipulation, we defer to contingent matters about the empirical world to determine the intention of that word. So, supposing it's really true that, back in the 17th century, people using the word water were using it for whatever shares the chemical essence of the stuff that they were drinking when they weren't drinking beer and wine. That's perhaps more common in the 17th century. The stuff they were drinking, swimming in when they were swimming, they didn't do that much of that then. The stuff that's clear in lakes and rivers, rains from the sky and so on. Supposing they were using the word for whatever shares its underlying chemical essence, then for them, the intention of the word water, the meaning of the word water, was not wholly a non-empirical matter. And if the intention of one of the words you're using to express a proposition is empirical, then it should be no surprise that you can't know a priori just by thinking about it whether that proposition is true or false, even if a proposition is necessary. But it's not because the proposition is a posteriori. It's not that there's a proposition which, once fully understood, you would not be able to identify as, oh yeah, it's a necessary proposition. Rather, what's a posteriori here is which proposition a sentence expresses. And once you do fully know the intention of the word water, insofar as you do know that water refers to H2O in all possible worlds, then you can see that the proposition expressed by water is H2O is necessary. If you couldn't, then we would have never gotten into this post-Kripkean situation of recognizing a sort of a posteriori necessity. So,
right, yeah, the counterexample relies on our being able to tell that there's some kind of necessity here, right? And that's sort of what you're pointing.
Exactly right. Exactly, that's exactly it. So yeah, these kinds of a posteriori necessities exist, but our very ability to recognize them depends on what I've said is a trivial truth, that once you know the intention, trivially, you're in a position to see whether the proposition's necessary. Now, in order to rebut the concern that maybe the necessitation of consciousness by the physical world might also be an a posteriori kind of necessitation, I think that's actually probably all that you need. And the further theoretical machinery people have introduced in this context enriches our understanding, but at least the details of it are not very important. But I'll just add that it is useful to think of what's going on in this kind of situation in terms of two parts or two dimensions to the meaning of a term like water. So the part of the meaning of water, or the aspect of its meaning, that an ordinarily competent speaker who hasn't done any chemistry understands, can usefully be thought of as what some people call its primary intention, where a primary intention is a function from a world considered as if it were the actual world to its extension. So if I find myself tomorrow in a world where actually that stuff coming from the taps and in the lakes and rivers doesn't have the molecular structure of H2O and it was all a big hoax, I will say, it's turned out water isn't H2O after all, right? Because I've still got my understanding of how to identify the extension of water in the actual world around me. So, if we're considering that possibility as though it were actual, I would say, oh, look, water is X, Y, Z. It's useful to think of the meaning of water, which an ordinarily competent speaker may well be ignorant of, the part of the meaning that depends on the presumed, but not a priori known empirical nature of water. It's useful to call that the secondary intention, where a secondary intention is a function from a world conceived merely as a counterfactual scenario we're talking about to whatever shares the actual essence of water. Now, I don't know, my experience when I first came across this distinction between primary and secondary intentions was, this is really hard to get a grasp of. I spent a whole summer reading all the literature on it about 8 years ago, and I finally thought, wow, this is so useful and so illuminating. And I now my opinion is this should really be more central to the way people think about philosophy of mind, about metaphysics, and so on. But it is hard going. I think, you know, our minds are well formed to naturally use terms in such a way as, on reflection, they have primary and secondary intentions, but we're not well kitted out to immediately get a solid grasp on how these function theoretically. But what I would say is we need to recognize something like this distinction between two dimensions to the meaning of certain kinds of word in order to make sense of some pretty simple facts, like the fact that I can say water could have turned out to be XYZ, to have a different molecular structure rather than H2O, or I can say tomorrow I could find out that we were wrong, that water is H2O. I can say these things without contradicting myself, without saying something incoherent, while at the same time saying I think water is necessarily H2O. Water has to be H2O. Well, those two claims are consistent with another because the second is making use of a secondary intention, which I take to be dependent on the actual nature of water, whereas the first is considering as actual, as if actual, a hypothetical possible world in which the stuff that an ordinarily competent speaker identifies as water is not H2O. All right, there's loads more to be said about that. I've cut it down to the bone. Let's see let's get back to the philosophy of mind. I've said that necessary propositions are trivially a priori once understood. Once you have understood, at least if we accept standard intentional semantics, once you've understood the intention of a necessary proposition, whether it's that, you know, all bachelors are unmarried, or that everything that's painted green is spatially extended, once you've understood it, you're going to be in a position to see that it is necessary and therefore true. If not, then by definition, you haven't grasped its intention. Now we can ask, well, couldn't the fact that a physical duplicate of the actual world must be a phenomenal duplicate of the actual world, couldn't that fact which is needed, according to most people, for physicalism to be true, couldn't this be a necessary truth that we've not fully understood? Just like, you know, it's a necessary truth that water is H2O, but when you haven't fully understood the intentions of those terms, you can't tell a priori that it's so. Well, if that were the case, if it were the case that this were a necessary truth that we hadn't fully understood, the intention of which we hadn't fully understood, this would have to be for one of two reasons. It would have to either be because we haven't fully understood the intention of the physical terms we use to describe the world, whatever physical descriptions we use as we fill out our understanding of the zombie world, or it would have to be because we haven't understood the phenomenal descriptions of our conscious experiences as they strike us from the inside. So we've got two options there, and neither is tenable for a physicalist. At least it seems to me. And by the way, I think this is what most people think. This is my favorite way of putting it with respect to this argument. So the first option says, okay, maybe we haven't fully understood the intention of the physical referring terms, the terms that refer to like the fundamental particles and fields, the four fundamental forces, whatever we're bringing in there, maybe also terms from chemistry, neuroscience. Maybe we haven't fully understood the intention of those terms, such that were we to fully understand the intention of those terms, we would be able to see that those physical things duplicated do necessitate the existence of consciousness. Well, that will turn out to be equivalent to saying perhaps the physical things have some further deep nature we haven't grasped which necessitates the existence of phenomenal consciousness. And some people want to take that view, but those people are panpsychists like Philip Goff or Galen Strawson. They're not materialist physicalists in the ordinary sense of the word. They end up positing that conscious experience or something consciousness necessitating that physical science leaves out is part of the ultimate nature of reality.
That's the crucial bit. The crucial bit is that it's something that science leaves out, right? So like we're not just hewing closely towards science. Like even if someone wants to go like pan-protopsychism, say, and said that there are these, strictly speaking, non-phenomenal properties which serve as the kind of, let's say, the intrinsic nature of the physical world, they're still going to be proto-phenomenal in the sense that they bear some kind of a priori connection to consciousness or something like that. And that certainly is not a posit in our best physical theories. So like that's, I think, what I want to emphasize.
I think that's a really good point. That point would be less important if the motivations for either pan-protopsychism or some kind of dualism could be shown actually to refute pan-protopsychism and to entail that the deep nature of the physical, to entail consciousness, has to be phenomenal, not just proto-phenomenal. And for reasons I'm going to touch on lightly, I actually think that's the case. I actually think that pan-protopsychism turns out to be incompatible with the motivations that typically lead to it. Maybe I won't say much about that.
No, that's good. My main point was just...
I'll explain it in detail in my book at some point.
Yeah, that's good. My main point was just that, like, it seems like, I guess, standard physicalism, where we're just like hewing very closely to to the science, and we're not positing anything beyond what the physicists tell us. That seems to be kind of off the table with respect to this response.
Exactly right. Yeah, if you're saying we've misunderstood the intentions of the physical terms in such a way that their actual reference necessarily entail the existence of consciousness, we're no longer getting anything like a scientific explanation of consciousness. We're adding what some people might think rather spooky further elements to the world described by science in order to explain consciousness. So physicalists aren't going to want to say that. The other option, which they might find at face value more attractive, is to say that we fail to see that the zombie world's impossible, that the physical duplicate of the world necessitates consciousness, because we don't fully understand our phenomenal descriptions. We don't understand what we mean when we say someone in this possible world is undergoing pain or undergoing a red visual sensation or whatever it might be. Now, I think the point that has been underemphasized in the literature or never put as clearly as I would like to see it put, whether or not I've managed here, is that it's really, really implausible that the zombie world seems possible only because we do not understand our phenomenal descriptions. To be fair, this is what David Chalmers is getting at when he says phenomenal terms are semantically neutral. They don't have different primary and secondary intentions. This is what Philip Goff is getting at when he says phenomenal concepts are transparent. To possess them is to grasp what it essentially is for the referent of that concept to exist. But the way I would want to put it is something like this. To say that the zombie world seems possible only because we don't understand our physical descriptions, this would be a way of saying that certain things in the zombie world count as phenomenally conscious, even though they do not satisfy the intentions of phenomenal terms or concepts as we understand them. And I think it's pretty clear that that is another way of saying that phenomenal consciousness as we understand it does not exist in a minimal physical duplicate of the actual world, right? Its intention is not satisfied, or therefore for a physicalist in the actual world, because the actual world is a minimal physical duplicate of the actual world par excellence for a physicalist. So I think it's actually really clear, without needing a lot of the distinctive theoretical machinery that gets introduced in discussions of this stuff, just using kind of regular intentional semantics, that there's no way you can rescue phenomenal consciousness as we understand it within the physical world by taking this option, by saying it's an a posteriori necessity because we don't understand the intention of our phenomenal terms, the intentions of our phenomenal terms or concepts. The conclusion that you're led to if you do take this option, it would seem to me, is that phenomenal consciousness as we understand it, what Chalmers would call phenomenal consciousness as understood under the primary intention of our terms. People who take the meta-semantic view of two-dimensional semantics would put this slightly differently. I don't think it matters for my purposes. This would mean that it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. That thing that intuitively exists and is not conceptually entailed by the physical does not actually exist in the minimal physical duplicate of the actual world. And so if physicalism is true, it doesn't exist in the actual world either. Now, some physicalists are willing to accept that, but it's an extreme and counterintuitive view. All right, this is the final slide on why we should accept this second premise of the conceptual argument. Then we're going to go to parts 2 and 3 of the presentation, which are a little shorter than part 1. So hopefully this will fit together okay. All right, so that's an explanation of why, yeah, it is true that Kripke, or maybe Kripke and Putnam, identified a kind of exception to what I want to call a kind of trivial minimal modal rationalism, which says just that, well, once you've understood a proposition, you can tell its modal status, you can tell if it's necessary. The kind of exception is that, well, quite often we're working with terms, with statements where we do not understand fully the proposition they express. And that's exactly right. It's a profound and important insight into the nature of language. However, it's really clear that the necessitation of consciousness by the physical world cannot be that kind of a posteriori necessity. That's not going to work. And kind of good news here is that I think that's actually generally accepted. In my experience, it's mainly people who are not specialists on this stuff who think that the Kripke style a posteriori necessity is going to help out the physicalist here. Most people in the literature, I think, accept that that's not going to work. There is one other option that some people want to consider, which is that maybe the necessitation of consciousness by the physical world could be what has been called a strong necessity, where that means a necessary truth that remains a posteriori even when it is fully understood. But what I want to say about that is that I mean, a lot of ink has been spilled on this, people debating whether these could exist. Harry Cleveley, very brilliant thinker, did his PhD, I think, with David Papineau. He's got some really good writing about this, arguing that strong necessities are impossible. But I actually think strong necessities are trivially incoherent given ordinary intentional semantics. So long as we're saying intentions are functions from possible worlds to extensions, then, and that to understand the meaning of a term is at least in part, if you're going to fully understand it, is in part to understand its intention, then it's just incoherent to say that someone understands the intention of a necessary proposition without being in a position to see that it is necessary. So I don't think, strong necessities, I think, is not an option at all. The conclusion I draw here is that anyone who is going to go along, any physicalist who's going to go along with modal talk at all, never mind skepticism about modal epistemology, which I think is sometimes quite reasonable. If you're going to accept that we can talk about possibilities as opposed to just like conceivabilities, you're going to have to reject the existence of phenomenal consciousness as we understand it, utilizing phenomenal concepts. And that seems like a really crazy idea. Eric Schwitzgebel has pointed out that all views about the mind-body problem are crazy from a certain perspective. So I'm not expressing any disrespect for the people who adopt that idea. I've got a picture of Keith Frankish's collection on illusionism there. He's a brilliant thinker, reportedly also a really great guy who defends this. I also think that, like, good physicalist theories tend to recognize that they have to say ultimately that phenomenal consciousness as we ordinarily conceive of it does not exist, although some play down that conclusion rhetorically, right? They make a big deal about, of course consciousness exists, but then they say, well, by that I mean, a functional property which is no more distinctively mental than the operation of an automatic door. I find that to be less helpful if we're in the collaborative pursuit of truth. But I do think it's pretty unavoidable for a physicalist to accept modal talk at all, to have phenomenal consciousness. And well, maybe some people would just get rid of all modal talk, but that would seem like a pretty big ad hoc move if you're doing it just to avoid being a dualist or accepting immaterial, at least phenomenal properties. And even then, I think you might well find out you end up with some deflationary explanation of modal language or fictionalism or whatever, and you end up being a kind of deflationary dualist instead of a deflationary physicalist, but you still can't get around your first order metaphysical theory being dualism. Okay.
Yeah, can I ask just one quick question about that? I'll restrict it to this. There's much more that can be said for the audience. Like check out Ralph's book, some of his other work that I've linked in the description. Please do that. It's excellent. But for purposes of time, I'll just ask this one question. I know you mentioned briefly modal skepticism. Can you just elaborate a little bit on how, let's say, a mitigated modal skepticism might interact with this argument? Do you think it makes any difference to it? I'm thinking of views along the lines of Peter Van Inwagen, Felipe Leon, I think Bob Fisher, and several others, where they're just generally pretty skeptical about claims about metaphysical modality that are quite far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience. And I think many of them would at least include within that category of claims that are far removed from our ordinary humdrum experience, things like zombie worlds, say.
Yeah.
So how would that kind of interact with the argument? Is the argument immune from that kind of view? Turn your view.
I think this is a really useful and interesting way to put pressure on the line of argument, and I think it depends on the specifics of the modal skeptics. So in some cases, I think that there are some kinds of modal skepticism where there is a failure to recognize that if you want to be dismissive of modal knowledge, you have to be dismissive of semantic knowledge as ordinarily understood. And maybe one can do that, right? Quine, in his Two Dogmas of Empiricism, tries to argue, well, we have no coherent understanding of conceptual truths or of the meanings that they depend upon. I think like a staunch Quinean might be satisfied with that. But of course, Quine in that paper does not consider what has now become the standard possible world semantics of modal talk, and gives us no reason to reject it. Once you've accepted in some form the standard semantics of modal talk, it's going to have to be the case that the worlds that determine the meanings, the ordinary meanings of terms, are the worlds that determine the meanings of our terms in all counterfactual talk. And it seems to me your only real option is going to be taking a kind of, well, you might say, because of your skepticism, like you're more willing to say we don't understand the semantics in this particular case. General semantic knowledge in situations we're familiar with is indeed modal knowledge. Semantic knowledge in situations we're less familiar with, in far-fetched zombie world scenarios, would be modal knowledge, but we don't even have the semantic knowledge there. We don't even know what we're talking about. I think I had some interest in that. It really seems to me that we do know pretty well what we're talking about, and it seems like that to many physicalists as well. You're also, of course, going to run into trouble being able to express physicalism if you aren't able to talk about these scenarios as well. So I think expressing, petering out, as it's known, of an understanding of more far-fetched scenarios cuts both ways. Well, the other thing people might want to do is just generally, globally say, well, look, I actually think semantic meaning is determined by epistemically possible worlds, not metaphysically possible worlds. I think you can do that, but you're almost certainly going to have to give up on all modal truths. You won't be able to say like, oh yeah, it is epistemically possible to have a world where you got a physical duplicate of you but no consciousness, but it's not metaphysically possible. You won't be able to draw those kinds of distinctions because we can't talk about metaphysical possibilities as opposed to epistemic possibilities unless the meanings of our terms are determined by metaphysically possible worlds. So I think I'm pretty confident that for each of these strategies, there is a cost that is far from worth paying, but there is work to do thinking about them individually. And I'm trying to write a paper on this at the moment where I go through each of these. It's going to be really great if I get around to finishing it. But fortunately, I can already see a priori that there's a refutation of all the objections because of the stuff I already said.
Of course. Okay, well, let's go on to part 2.
All right, part 2. So I was going to say more about part 2 and indeed part 3, but part 2 in particular I've truncated because this is really the focus of my book, and you can find a couple of places I talk about it online already. So what I presented there is like my best attempt to make pellucid the force of quite a popular argument against materialism about consciousness. And I think there's reason to think, actually, if you're not a materialist about consciousness, you really should accept the soundness of the argument given there. The only reason to challenge it would be that you feel you've got really good reasons to be a materialist. Now, although that argument's quite popular, it has not, and neither has auxiliary arguments like the Mary argument, it has not led to a big revival of what I see as the historically predominant view, according to which we have these independent minds. They look a bit like Cartesian or Platonic or Vaisheshika souls. Rather, people have tried to adopt more moderate, middle ground positions, which I see as all being essentially one or another version of property dualism. So here's the received view as I see it on this slide. Minds and bodies seem very different. People like Descartes propose that this is because they are indeed separate substances, whatever that means. However, we can't accept what Descartes says because there's this big problem known as the interaction problem. How could an immaterial mind interact closely with a physical body? As surely it must if the mind is immaterial. That led people to adopt physicalism around the middle of the 20th century. We'll get onto that in the third part. Recently, arguments like the one I've just given have created serious interest in the idea that, okay, maybe physicalism, maybe materialism isn't quite right. Maybe the conscious mind does involve some non-physical properties that are left out of fundamental physics, left out of chemistry, neuroscience. But we should still avoid the idea of an immaterial mind as a substance in its own right. That's certainly kind of the view I was taught as an undergraduate. I think it's widely repeated. I've collected a bunch of quotations, which I have on one page of the book, of people saying, yeah, property dualism is kind of interesting, but substance dualism is completely absurd. A lot of people say this. I think there's a real puzzle to begin with about how that kind of consensus ever emerged. So again, I'm interested both in this stuff as philosophy and also as history of ideas. I think it's often best to do these things in tandem. At least if you find both interesting, you might find one of them tedious, and then you might as well ignore it. So property dualists take pains to reassure us that they posit non-physical properties only. They will often say, we're not positing non-physical substances like Descartes. They standardly use Descartes as the example. And they put this forward as somehow a better view. It's more naturalistic. It's more amenable to the scientific spirit, which I agree would be a good thing in some ways, because science is really impressive and valuable. I think we should take it tremendously seriously. However, what they don't tend to do, property dualists don't tend to explain what the substance property distinction is. And you know, these terms have been used in a lot of different ways in the history of philosophy. They don't have a standard use in contemporary discussions, so they do need some clarification. And furthermore, they don't tend to give any tenable argument for thinking that property dualism is better than substance dualism. They kind of presuppose that this is more moderate, better, more scientific. And I'd say, like, to give such an argument, we would probably need first a clarification of what exactly the distinction between properties and substances is meant to be. And insofar as such an argument gets given, this is true of Chalmers in The Conscious Mind. It's true of Jackson in Epiphenomenal Qualia, I think, if he gives an argument at all. Certainly true of Jae-Gon Kim in Physicalism or something near enough. They tend to say something about the interaction problem, while nonetheless at the same time in the same work saying, okay, but the interaction problem actually faces property dualism too, and is just as troublesome for property dualists. So that's obviously not a good reason. So this is what I worked on in my PhD, and I came to the conclusion that once you've clarified what the relevant distinction is between substances and properties, actually substance dualism, for all its notoriety in contemporary intellectual culture, which is very great, not just in analytic philosophy, it's the preferable option of the two, because property dualism turns out to be straightforwardly undermined by the very considerations that motivate it. So here's quickly why I think that. First of all, what is the substance property distinction that's relevant in this context? Well, there are basically two crucial works for the historical usage of this term in Western philosophy. So in Aristotle's Categories, he defines substances as things that, he defines properties, or if we're being more precise, all of the non-substantial categories, as things that cannot exist separately, things that have to exist in a substance. And it follows from that definition in the Categories that the ability to exist separately, to exist by oneself, is at least a sufficient condition for being a substance. Interestingly, in the Indian Nyaya Vaisheshika tradition, you get a very similar conception of substance there. Maybe there was some interaction, or maybe this is just an intuitive way of dividing up the world. So in Aristotle's Categories, it's pretty clear that what we would now call a property is something that can't exist by itself, and that a sufficient condition for being a substance would be the ability for something to exist by itself. And the Categories is probably the most read work in the whole of ancient philosophy, the whole of Western philosophy, for at least 1300 years, maybe a couple of millennia. It was the first work read by everyone trained in philosophy in the kind of Greco-Roman world and the later medieval Byzantine Arabic Islamic world as well. So that's a really good route for like how people have used this term historically. From Descartes on, many people have adjusted this definition slightly, if it counts as an adjustment, insofar as they make it explicit that the ability for something to exist by itself is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for being a substance. Now, what do we mean by could exist by itself here? We don't mean could exist by itself without any qualification. This is really important. Descartes himself is really clear on this. He says, for example, like a substance, if we're thinking about what he would call created entities, a substance can't exist without God. After all, God's a necessary being. Nothing can exist without God. So he says, substance is something that can exist by itself, setting aside God. I think actually the implicit notion, roughly, that tends to be shared by people who use the term in this way is that a substance is something that could exist by itself, leaving aside abstracter and necessary entities. That gets us a fairly sharp notion, which does useful theoretical work. And we can illustrate the usefulness of this notion by saying, we've got a picture of a desk here, which I've cunningly drawn in paint, because when I made this first version of this slide, ChatGPT couldn't do really good diagrams. The size of the desk is not a separate substance to the desk. We can tell this because it's not possible to put the rest of the desk minus its size over here and keep the size of the desk over here. This isn't even a coherent proposal neither could we eliminate everything else in the world except for the size of a desk. At least intuitively, if we're wrong about that, the size of the desk is a substance. By contrast, the drawer of the desk is intuitively a separate substance because it can exist separate from the rest of a desk. We could burn the rest of a desk, but just keep that drawer. Unlike the shape of a desk, the size of a desk, its density, the drawer is to that extent a separate substance. I actually think like this is partly a pragmatic distinction which can be made in different ways for different purposes. Even if you're a super substantivalist, someone who thinks that like really there's only one substance, we can always add some caveats to our substance property distinction when it comes to entities within the world to draw useful distinctions. In the context just of the mind-body problem, however, I think a version of this definition of substance is appropriate for multiple reasons. First of all, Descartes is the classic substance dualist. When he says the mind is a substance, not just a property of the body, he is using substance in this way. There's some interpretive debate. I've discussed this in some of my writing, but it's very clear to me, at least, that that's how he's using it. Secondly, if by a substance we mean something that is separable, at least within the domain of concrete contingent things, leaving aside necessary beings abstracta, then this would capture what is usually taken for granted, that substance dualists, unlike property dualists, say that the mind could in principle exist without the body and without other people's minds as well. It's precisely that A makes substance dualism, as it's described in contemporary literature, somewhat imprecisely resemble the predominant view of most historical societies, most historical philosophers. And B, it's precisely that accounts for the not unreasonable idea that substance dualism is spooky, that it involves something that looks like a ghost in the machine. Some people say Ryle was caricaturing substance dualism when he described it that way. He caricatures it a lot, but actually that description is kind of illuminating, in my opinion. All right, so let's say substances are things that can exist by themselves, at least within some domain of quantification, maybe leaving aside God, leaving aside necessary beings and abstracta. Properties, on the other hand, are things that can't exist by themselves, that have to belong to a substance with some other properties. I think this is a really useful, coherent distinction. I actually think you can't get away from operating with this distinction. I mean, the entire world, no matter what view you have of the universe taken as a whole, is going to end up a substance in the sense that it can exist by itself, reality in its totality. And then anything that can't exist independently of it is going to be a property. There is one classic objection to this use of the term substance, which I think maybe has held back discussions in the philosophy of mind, has led people to be cagey about getting into the substance property distinction. The objection says that, well, according to this definition, according to the claim that a substance is something that can exist by itself, nothing could possibly be a substance. Why not? Because everything necessitates its own parts and properties. Maybe there are mereologically simple things that don't have parts, at least they'll still have properties with which they are non-identical. So everything that exists is going to necessitate the existence of something further. So, I have a book here, a copy of volume 5 of Churchill's History of the Second World War. You might say the book is intuitively a substance. I mean, this is going to depend on some of our wider metaphysical views, but it's at least kind of plausible that there could exist a world that contained only this book. Certainly the book seems to be separable from other physical objects, from people's minds. And yet, of course, the book couldn't exist in the absence of all of its pages, and it couldn't exist in the absence of its shape and its size and its density and its color. So someone might say on those grounds, okay, so it can't exist by itself. It's, and this whole idea of a substance as something that can exist by itself makes no sense. Well, my opinion is like, this is an objection based on a simple misconstrual of what is meant when people define a substance as something that can exist by itself, or at least certainly what Descartes meant, certainly what Aristotle meant insofar as this was the definition he was going for. And certainly what we all ordinarily mean when we talk about something existing or doing something by itself. So, if I said to someone, if they asked me what was left on my desk, and I said, oh, just this copy of volume 5 of Churchill's History there by itself. If they said to me it wasn't by itself, its size was there too. Of course, I would say, like, well, this is a silly thing to say, you know what I mean. And if I wanted to clarify what I mean, I say, when I speak of a thing being there by itself, I draw a distinction between what is included within it, what is intrinsic to it, and what is not. And for the book to be there by itself, it has to be there without anything extrinsic to it, but it's allowed to have its own parts and its own properties. There's a bunch more to clarify about that. There are hair-splitting objections. There's a really great 17,000-word article that Review of Metaphysics somehow let me publish, where I go into some of this stuff. It's called Bring Back Substances. I'd love it if someone read it someday. Anyway, if you're interested, that's where I discuss this further. All right, so that's the substance property distinction. Now, I think once we've got that clarified, we can already see there's something strange about property dualism. There's something strange about the idea that, yeah, phenomenal properties like the luminosity of the color patch in my visual field as it's experienced by me, like the achiness of my shoulder from spending too much time at the laptop, that phenomenal properties are immaterial, they're not physical, but they belong to a physical body. It's actually hard to picture what that belonging could consist in. There's quite a good suggestive article by John Searle where he uses the metaphor of the property dualists' phenomenal properties being like frosting on a cake, where the cake is the body or the brain. Actually, in that article, I think Searle gives an unsound argument against property dualism, but I do like the imagery he uses. Well, I would suggest that once it's seen that the relevant substance property distinction in the context of the mind-body problem is a modal distinction between what can and can't exist by itself, it actually quite quickly follows that the motivations that lead to property dualism, at least if they include this modal conceptual argument about the zombie world, those very motivations undermine property dualism and entail, well, that phenomenal properties belong to mental substances, that the conscious mind is a mental substance, not merely a complex of mental properties. So why is that? Well, the basic point is this. We've seen what I called the conceptual argument against physicalism, basically a version of conceivability argument, which I do think, well, for one thing, we have good survey data suggesting that the overwhelming majority of opponents of physicalism about the mind do accept the soundness of that argument. Furthermore, I think any opponent of materialism about the mind should accept the soundness of that argument. We've already seen that argument, how it works. It seems to me that it is possible to deliver a logically homologous argument for the conclusion that the phenomenal facts about the world, plus a that's all clause, do not necessitate anything physical. So I call this the phenomenal disembodiment argument. It goes, well, it can be put as follows. Premise one, it's not a conceptual truth that the phenomenal facts about the world necessitate the physical facts about the world. Premise two, if it's not a conceptual truth that the phenomenal facts about the world necessitate the physical facts, that should say, then the phenomenal facts do not necessitate the physical facts, therefore the phenomenal facts do not necessitate the physical facts. Now, it seems to me that just as the zombie argument entails not only that consciousness is something in addition to the physical, but also that the physical world taken as a whole and any separable parts thereof are physical substances. Likewise, the phenomenal disembodiment argument, if it were sound, at least taking into account a few very plausible assumptions, would entail not only, again, that the physical and the phenomenal are metaphysically distinct, but also that the phenomenal world taken as a whole and any separate parts of it, including my mind, if my mind doesn't conceptually necessitate yours, which I don't think anyone would say it would, is made up of non-physical substances, right? The very same modal line of reasoning is relevant not just to distinctness, but to substantial distinctness, we might say. Now, why would you accept the first premise of this argument? It's not a conceptual truth that the phenomenal facts necessitate the physical facts. Well, the standard way of motivating that is to make use of Descartes' "could I be dreaming" line of reasoning. Is it a coherent? Can I coherently suppose that everything's as it is phenomenally, but I'm dreaming? So there isn't a desk in front of me. There isn't the laptop here, really. These are all dream experiences. Most people are inclined to say, yes, that is coherent. And more importantly, I think basically all opponents of physicalism about consciousness are inclined to say, yeah, that's conceptually coherent. So I don't expect much pushback to that premise from my opponents here, who are now the property dualists. Second premise, why would we accept that? Well, I won't bore you by going through it all again, but I will just ask you to believe on my say-so, or you can think it through or look it up in the book. But the very considerations that make the equivalent of that premise true in the case of the zombie argument make it true in the phenomenal disembodiment argument as well. But basically, this comes down to it being the case that when it comes to conscious experiences, when it comes to phenomenal language or phenomenal concepts, necessary truths about their relation to the physical are going to have to be conceptual truths. The only other option is that those concepts don't refer at all. There is no conscious experience. If those are true, then you get pretty quickly to the conclusion that the phenomenal world, the mental world, can exist without anything physical, which means there's at least one mental substance, and presumably more if different people's minds don't necessitate one another's minds. Now, there are some details to fill in there.
Yeah, can I ask one question?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
So I know your dialectical opponents for that argument are property dualists, so they're not probably going to go in for what I'm about to say. But I did just want to maybe pose this, and I wanted to pose it earlier, but for whatever reason I didn't get a chance to. So what do you think about the kind of general Quinean skepticism about sharp distinctions between conceptual truths and non-conceptual truths? I know you briefly mentioned this, but I'm curious if you want to say anything more about this. Like Quine said, hey, listen, dude, all of our beliefs are subject to the tribunal of experience. We just have this web of beliefs. There really isn't any sharp distinction here between what's conceptual and non-conceptual. And I'm wondering if at least physicalists might try to push back on the conceptual argument in that kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot that I might say about that. What I said earlier was just that, well, look, in Quine's paper, okay, let me say the two or three things I think about Quine's approach, which I think has really informed this way of thinking more broadly. In Quine's paper, one thing I don't like about two dogmas of empiricism, illuminating though it is in some respects, is that it belongs to a genre of philosophy paper where someone purports not to understand an idea, in this case, the idea of analyticity, and then they try out various explanations for it. Whenever they hit a good explanation, they say, but to understand this, we would need to understand analyticity or the target concept, and so we can't accept that. And this is, it seems to me, I'm not sure you could really write that paper successfully unless you secretly understood the target idea, which you happen to be able to give good explanations of, but then recognize you couldn't understand those explanations if you didn't understand that idea. That looks a bit suspect to me. But also, I would say this looks a bit like a universal acid. You could use this to argue against our ability to understand many totally respectable concepts. So I'm not keen on that part of Quine's paper. The other thing, what I said about it earlier, was that he doesn't even consider what I take to be the now standard way of understanding conceptual truths in terms of the intentions of the predicates names that they involve. Once you see meanings as representable as intentions, which are functions from possible worlds to extensions, conceptual truth becomes a totally coherent, non-problematic idea, and any residual skepticism about the a priori epistemology of conceptual truths should be shifted onto the various ways in which the meanings of terms are empirically determined. One further thing that my further complaint about Quine's paper, the further way in which he failed to anticipate the brilliant insights of the subsequent decades, is that he doesn't distinguish between different ways in which the meanings of terms are determined empirically. And I'm inclined to say it's really important that I wouldn't insist on this, but for the purpose of these arguments, but it's important that the primary intention of a term can be determined empirically, and then the secondary intention can be determined by the extension of the primary intention at the actual world, but then applied to other possible worlds considered as actual, in such a way that you get two layers of empirical determination of the meaning of that term. Maybe, that to go into that in detail would take us too far afield. The basic point is, I think, the classic reasons of being like a general modal skeptic are not too great. There are also more specific things people will say in this context, like they'll give examples of putative conceptual truths that have turned out to be wrong as a kind of a nursery tale warning against budding metaphysicians. So they'll say, like, you sometimes hear it said that, people used to think it was analytic, that space is Euclidean, and then Einstein refuted this empirically. So couldn't that be what's going on when you think it's a conceptual truth that phenomenal consciousness is non-physical? I've yet to encounter such an example that I found to be correctly described as such as it would have to be compelling. So taking that, like, it was once considered analytic or conceptual that space was Euclidean claim, I think that goes back to Hilary Putnam in an article responding to Quine, where, he says it was once as close to analytic as anything non-analytic is. I'm not quite sure how we should understand his claim there, but what I want to say is, supposing anyone ever took it to be a conceptual truth that space is Euclidean, then given what we understand about semantics, it is correct to say that what must have been going on is that what they had in mind so they recognized a conceptual truth, which is that space, as understood according to a fairly intuitive conception of it, like an arena in which objects can move about without changing shape, without deforming in shape, and when they move in a closed loop without rotating, they don't return a different way up, right? I think that's a common sense understanding. And if that's what you mean by space, yeah, it's a conceptual truth that space is Euclidean. Like, there are important mathematical insights about how that is indeed the case, as I understand it. But the mistake they have made is if indeed anyone ever made this, is in taking it for granted that the empirical world satisfies that conception of space. It looked a lot like it did, but it didn't. And that's we should be on the lookout for cases where the empirical world does not satisfy our concepts, though it seems like it does. But if someone in the context of the mind-body problem wanted to appeal to like that kind of a mistake, then this would come down to saying maybe phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist. Maybe we think these concepts are satisfied, but they're actually not satisfied. This isn't an example of something seeming to be a conceptual truth to someone who has understood the intentions of the words involved when it was not. And I'm confident that that's actually an incoherent notion. There's more, I would say, even
yeah,
about
that's helpful.
that particular example, but maybe that's
that's
some
good.
of the reason why I don't think at least I think like people will sometimes use this as like a quick and easy way of dismissing these modal arguments, and I think actually it needs to be filled out really carefully to be sure there's a compelling way to push back that. So we're really getting close to the final straight. So the first premise here, I think, as you say, my target here is property dualists who accept the conceptual argument against materialism in the zombie direction, as opposed to the phenomenal disembodiment direction, or what you might call the ghost direction. And so they're going to accept, I think, both premise 1 and premise 2 once they're stated clearly enough. And I think that forces them to accept non-physical substances with taking into account like a few details, which I've talked about in some of my writing. So I put forward in my book the Parity Argument, as I call it, which says, if you accept the conceptual argument for dualism, you have to accept the phenomenal disembodiment argument. If you accept the phenomenal disembodiment argument, you have to posit non-physical substance. Therefore, if you accept the conceptual argument for dualism, you have to posit non-physical substances. That's just a way of like bringing it all together. It's kind of like a Matryoshka doll argument with arguments within it. I really think like, I absolutely grant there are details to pick over here, but I really think at face value, it's pretty clear that if you're going to reject materialism and see the conscious mind as immaterial, the default view ought to be on the theoretical grounds we have that it's a non-physical substance, rather than some weird complex of non-physical properties clinging on to a brain. And I suspect the only reason that the latter has been the more popular view is due to a wider hostility to the idea of non-physical substances. So I'm going to, in this final section, say something about the official reason why people have not liked non-physical substances and why I don't think it's as compelling as people usually suppose, which isn't to say I don't think there are other important challenges to the idea. So insofar as people explain why they don't want to be a Platonic, Cartesian, interactionist substance dualist, they will say, well, there's this problem of mind-body interaction. It's not clear how an immaterial mind interacts with a material body, and yet we know our minds interact with our bodies. And insofar as this argument against substance dualism has been clarified in the literature, by far away the most influential version is what's known as the causal closure argument. Now, well, let's put the argument first of all. So the causal closure argument, it can be put in slightly different ways as always. I don't think there's anything controversial or underhand about how I put it here. Premise 1, all physical effects are fully determined by prior physical occurrences. Premise 2, it would be absurd to suppose that the physical effects we attribute to the mind are caused twice over by independent causes. I have in mind that. Conclusion, therefore, the mind must be physical. You get an early version of that argument in a David Lewis paper, and then you get, well, various other presentations. But I think David Papineau's, I think it's like 2 chapters and 1 paper where he goes into this in a lot of detail, reusing some material, but slightly different, 2001, 2002, 2009, of the real canonical statements of the argument these days. Now, the first thing I want to say about this argument is, as I've already mentioned, this is not really a good reason for being a property dualist rather than a substance dualist, because it's more or less universally recognized that it poses an equal problem to either view, right? If my conscious mind is a complex of non-physical properties that nonetheless belong to my brain or body as the physical bearer of those properties. And if all physical effects are fully determined by prior physical causes, irrespective of what non-physical properties might be clinging on, well, then it's going to look like, in order for the non-physical states in my mind to have any physical effects, the physical effects of those mental states would have to be caused by over, by both their non-physical mental and their physical causes. If that's absurd, well, presuming the mind has any physical effect on the world at all, it must itself be physical. I should say, actually, like I've put this argument here in a way that glosses over some aspects of it where I'm just in agreement with the proponents of the causal closure argument. So first of all, and most importantly, the argument, if I've put it here, just takes it for granted that mental causes have physical effects, in particular if we're talking about the conscious mind, but phenomenal causes have physical effects. Of course, there are versions of dualism on which that's not true. There is the traditional parallelist view, according to which God sets up mind and body to just like chug along in harmony with one another. There's the more recent epiphenomenalist view on which consciousness is, to use the classic metaphor, like the steam arising from a locomotive, which is caused by the mechanism, but does not play any further role in causing the further activity of the mechanism. Now, I find efforts to make epiphenomenalism look coherent kind of intellectually interesting, but I'm willing to grant like it's comparably counterintuitive to consciousness denialism, to illusionism or whatever. It's almost as bad, maybe even worse than saying phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist. So I just want to agree with the proponents of the causal closure argument that if a dualist has to be an epiphenomenalist, then that's really bad news for dualism. With that presupposition in place, I think it's right to say that there are really just two places that this argument can be attacked. One is the claim that it is absurd to suppose that the physical effects we attribute to the mind are caused twice over, right? So some people have wanted to say, okay, well, look, maybe all physical effects are fully determined by prior physical occurrences, but maybe, you know, they have mental causes as well. And there is a certain sense in which you can make that sound kind of plausible. Nature has a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of cases where some effect actually has multiple distinguishable sufficient causes. This isn't at all unusual. I'm not going to go into this in detail now, but here again, I want to say actually the proponent of the causal closure argument is right. So there are people in particular in E.J. Lowe's work. I think I see him as maybe the most sophisticated challenger of that premise. I've tried to show how multiple causes could nonetheless bring about the same effects without this being objectionable. I don't think this is workable. And just in summary, well, why not? You want to avoid the crazy coincidence according to which it just so happens that every time your mind causes something that your body does, like I feel a desire for a sip of the claret and I reach for the glass. You want to avoid the situation where just by coincidence, that's what was going to happen anyway, physically. That looks a bit weird. The best way of partially avoiding that coincidence maybe is to suppose that, well, what happens there is that certain physical causes in the nervous system cause the mental state, and then the mental state causes the next physical state in a law-like way, so that it's a physical state you'd have already expected given that prior physical state. Well, there are ways in which you can try to make this look kind of plausible, but no matter how you, as it were, draw the causal arrows, you will always find yourself in a situation where it would be possible to posit a simpler but equally explanatory set of causal laws or causal regularities, however you like to understand the metaphysics theory of causation. Some people don't even want to put it in terms of causation, but I don't think that really matters here. You could always posit a simpler set of causal laws that would account just as well for all the same effects. So, I mean, in brief, epiphenomenalism will always be as explanatorily powerful and yet simpler. Now, it seems to me ordinary standards of theory choice require us to accept a simpler theory, which is just as explanatory, and there would be something objectionably ad hoc if defenders of dualism were to make an exception to that rule just to avoid the causal closure argument. Why do we always accept the simpler theory when it is equally explanatory? Isn't that kind of an arbitrary idea? Well, maybe, but you can give it examples which seem to show why it's highly intuitive. So Philip Goff, I forget where he gets this. I don't think it's originally, often gives the example like, I could give you a theory exactly like our current best scientific and or philosophical theory of the cosmos, plus one invisible angel who never affects anything. My theory would be just as explanatorily powerful as yours, slightly more complex. And everyone would agree, we should accept your theory, not mine. My theory is somehow irrational. Well, if you accept that intuition there, I think you have to accept that systematic overdetermination of the effects of mental causes by independent physical causes is not, at least not an attractive option. There's a big cost there. By the way, I said at the start I'm talking about dualism, but actually I think it's really dualism or idealism, substance dualism or idealism, to which the arguments I'm talking about lead and which the argument I'm talking about now challenges. This is also true here. I think this is a less common view because idealism isn't discussed as much, but I think idealism interestingly faces exactly the same problem of mind-body interaction as dualism does, insofar as the physical evidence for causal closure is as powerful as it is often represented as being. And again, I set out what I think about this in a paper called Does Idealism Solve the Problem of Consciousness? At some point, I want to write a paper just on the causal closure problem, because I think that's an obscure place to bury the stuff I want to say about that argument. But I also have all this grading to do, and not all of this always gets done. All right, so that is to say, I think the causal closure argument, it's a really elegant argument, because on the basis of a couple of premises which I agree are really hard to resist, and one further premise which is only about the empirical nature of the physical world, which doesn't appeal to any a priori metaphysical reasoning, it draws the conclusion that the mind must be material, the conscious mind must be material. So that's what I have to say in favor of the argument. And I think at that stage, we're basically left with only two choices. It seems to me we have to either say, okay, phenomenal consciousness does not exist, or nothing like phenomenal consciousness as we understand it exists, which is, comes to the same thing. And so we're going to have to be probably some kind of illusionist, come up with a theory of why it seems so intuitive that this thing exists, which is not a priori entailed by the physical. Or we're going to have to say, no, that we need to accommodate these mental substances into our theory of the world and reject the causal closure of the physical. And I want to say, I think there's a degree to which my thinking up to that point is actually pretty close to the trend in the discipline. We don't have enough survey data to be sure, but my own impression is there is a trend towards thinking the best version of physicalism will reject phenomenal consciousness in anything like the way we understand it, and we'll have to accept that there is something pretty counterintuitive about that. And I think there is also a trend to saying the best forms of anti-materialism are going to have to reject the causal closure of the physical. So I'm going to say finally why I think the second of those options is much more attractive than it is ordinarily represented as being. And I want to emphasize again, I don't think that the theoretical adventure ends there, because I do think there are further big challenges for either of these options, including the immaterialist option, in particular, working out how to make our understanding of the conscious mind cohere with our understanding of the gestation of individual organisms, the evolution of species, with what we want to say about the isomorphisms between cognitive states and computational states. So there's loads more to be done. But I think this particular argument, the causal closure argument, though kind of beautiful philosophically, is critically flawed in that it depends on a premise which has never been anything like adequately supported. So this is the premise that says all physical facts are fully determined by prior physical occurrences. That the idea is like everything that happens in the physical world, including your own bodily actions, is a domino in a long domino run going all the way back to the Big Bang, and every domino that falls had to because of the previous one. As usually stated, this premise ignores the possibility that the physical world is indeterministic in some ways. I actually think that's a substantive problem which leads to another really big issue for the argument. Maybe I'll mention why, maybe not, but I think independent of physical indeterminism, this premise is in real trouble. So one thing to say about this premise is it is not something new. People have been forming the conviction that the physical world is causally closed in this sense, or something very like it, for a long time. So probably the best known example is Pierre-Simon Laplace. He says in 1814 that for an intellect which at a certain moment knew all forces that set in nature in motion and all positions of all items which nature is composed, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. Well, I take it that what Laplace is saying entails a version of a physical causal closure principle. Leibniz embraces a version of this principle back in the 17th century. That's why he recommends that a Cartesian dualist adopt a kind of parallelism rather than interactionism. I think we have very good evidence that Democritus embraced a version of this principle back in the pre-Socratic period, and that is why Epicurus introduced the idea of the swerve of the atom to make room for free will. So we shouldn't suppose that this is something people never form a belief in without adequate evidence, given that I don't suppose anyone now thinks that Laplace, Leibniz, or Democritus had really strong, clear-cut evidence in favor of the principle. Sometimes, on the evidence available, they might see no reason to reject it. They're not necessarily reasoning badly. It's just that they didn't have evidence that we would find threatening if we wanted to deny the principle now. So why might you accept this principle? Well, maybe I won't say too much about the case from physics, because I think this has been covered actually really well by proponents of the causal closure principle, in particular by David Papineau, but especially outside the specialist arguments about this issue, you often get people saying, well, we know from physics that everything that happens is brought about by the four fundamental physical forces. They'll often appeal to conservation principles. I mean, that was already going on with Leibniz. And they'll infer from that there is no room in the brain and the nervous system for any non-physical forces to be operational. That is to say, any forces that aren't already present in the standard model of physics, or whatever adjustment to that model we end up with. Now, I think the most important thing to say here is that whatever empirical constraints apply to the forces operational outside of the nervous systems of conscious beings, that their application within the nervous systems of conscious beings is going to be an a posteriori matter. It's going to be an empirical matter. And therefore, insofar as we do think we have any grounds to suppose things might be different in the case of the nervous systems of conscious beings to how they are in inanimate matter, we're going to need to gather our evidence for the obtaining of those constraints on what causes are operational, what forces are operational, directly from observations of the nervous systems of the animate beings, because even if there are, immaterial, the most spooky Cartesian soul you like dancing about in the brain, this isn't going to make any difference to what's going on in inanimate matter. Now, as it happens, of course, most of our fundamental physics inevitably comes from observations of inanimate matter. I mean, arguably not all of it. If you put a cow in a catapult, you can basically idealize it as a spherical object and calculate the trajectory. It works all right. But when we're getting to the details of the mechanics of the physical world, especially at the fundamental level, it's based on inanimate matter, for which reason it seems very clear to me that arguments against interactionist dualism on the basis of physics are committing what we could call the streetlight fallacy. So there's the well-known joke, a policeman sees a guy searching under a streetlight. In the version I first heard of this, it was Wittgenstein. I guess I was told it in Cambridge. And the policeman says, well, excuse me, sir, what are you doing? Is it Professor Wittgenstein? And Wittgenstein says, yes, I'm looking for my keys. And the policeman searches with him for a while and then says, are you sure this is where you lost them, sir? And Wittgenstein says, no, I lost them over there, but it's too dark to look for them over there. So I think looking in inanimate matter, looking in the Large Hadron Collider or whatever for the constraints on physical forces operational in the nervous system would be doing what Wittgenstein is doing. Yeah, it's easier to look in those places, but it's not going to tell us anything about what we want to know. I would absolutely concede, by the way, that like all things being equal, if inanimate matter only obeys four fundamental forces, then it is reasonable just by Occam's razor to assume that those are the only forces operational elsewhere. It's just that Occam's razor is a very weak principle, easily confuted by further evidence or arguments. And we have the stark, vibrant evidence of our own conscious minds to weigh against that like Occamist line of reasoning. I'd also just like a shout out, there's some great work by Brian Pitts looking in detail at how you might describe coherently an immaterial mind interacting with the material world in a way that breaches the symmetries in which conservation laws are based. And he would say, like, it's just an empirical matter whether this kind of thing happens. There's also a great paper by him and Aline Christophe Coucou discussing some of this stuff. And Aline Coucou, I think, has also done some great work looking more at biology. There's lots of good stuff on this out there. But I don't want to emphasize that in this final, and we are really getting to the final stuff I'm going to say. I don't want to emphasize that because actually, as I say, like, I take David Papineau to be the foremost proponent of the causal closure argument and the most sophisticated. And in his work on this, he actually does a very good job of explaining why the evidence from physics is at best inconclusive. And I think he would also say, like, if the physical world has only revealed four fundamental forces, there's an argument from Occam's razor to suppose those are the only ones operational, but the immaterial mind interacting with the body from our reasoning about phenomenal consciousness. Papineau would say we have no such good reason, so he might not be too worried about that, but he recognizes if we did, then we would need better evidence than physics can give us for the causal closure principle. Now, that part of Papineau's paper I think is really great, very interesting. But the further part of it, and I think this is the same in the three published versions I referenced, as well as more recent talks he's given on this stuff, I take issue with. So he suggests that while the evidence from physics is at best inconclusive, there is evidence for causal closure that comes directly from biology, which from the 1950s or 1960s becomes, well, in his words, clear cut. And Papineau says that is why he posits an explanation of the history of ideas, the subject I started out by talking about. He says that's why physicalism becomes the dominant view at that time. It just finally became too obvious on the basis of what we knew about the nervous system, the central nervous system, that there could not be non-physical forces operational within it. However, I mean, apart from kind of reasoning backwards from physicalism became popular then, so people must have had good reason to think the causal closure principle was true or something like that, he doesn't actually cite any specific experiment, any specific data. He doesn't give us, in these published works, the material we would need to be able to evaluate whether people had good reason to conclude that there were only 4 fundamental forces operational, or what exactly they came to believe at this time. In fact, really all Papineau says in this regard in the classic publication comes down essentially to one sentence. He says, well, they discovered DNA and so forth. That was impressive, although obviously that doesn't bear directly on this. And in the same period, neurophysiological research mapped the body's neuronal network and analyzed the electrical mechanisms responsible for neuronal activity. He says, on that basis, it no longer became tenable to suppose there were non-physical forces operational in the nervous system. So one thing I would say here is I definitely think philosophers of mind should do their best to understand as much neuroscience as they possibly can. Well, I mean, maybe as much of everything as they possibly can, but it's particularly relevant if you want to try to discuss this in a serious way. And I think neuroscience is really fascinating and does bear significantly on some of the issues philosophers of mind are interested in. But I've often wondered, what exactly does Papineau have in mind here by these somewhat vague descriptions of mapping the body's neuronal network and measuring the electrophysiological activity of the brain? And actually, naively, as I guess teenage student of philosophy, when I first came across this stuff, I thought to myself, okay, well, people seem to be really confident about this. Presumably, the evidence is really very good. Presumably, they can, more or less map the mechanics of the nervous system and predict what it's going to do next on the basis of physical forces, and then confirm that their predictions are, always right to within some reasonable margin of error, something like that. But anyone who knows anything about the history of neuroscience knows that nothing at all like that was done in the 50s and 60s, and indeed nothing at all like that has been done today or is likely to be done in the foreseeable, very long future. So I'm just going to mention a few things that one might consider relevant to what Papineau says here, and why I don't think these do anything like vindicate a firm conviction in the biological case for causal closure in the nervous system. So he talks about the mapping of the body's neuronal network. He says this happened in the sort of by the mid-20th century, 50s or 60s. To me, that would suggest the project that is now described as the mapping of the connectome, that is to say the connections between all of the neurons making up the brain. So the brain is like an incredibly complex system of neurons threaded together by these like gossamer electric cables known as neurites. And there's this really challenging, very interesting project to try to map the connections between all the neurons by the neurites. At least if we're talking about mapping the brain at the level presumed to be relevant to its distinctive functioning, that's what we mean, given that, well, since the late 19th century, we've seen the neuron as the basic functional unit of the brain. But that project didn't really even begin until the 1970s. And, well, at the time that Papineau publishes these articles, I think it's still by then correct to say the only organism for which it had been achieved was the, 302 neuron C. elegans nematode. In itself, an incredible scientific accomplishment and a really interesting accomplishment. They had to chemically freeze this tiny microscopic worm, slice it into ultra-thin sections, and then manually document the connections between the neurons. Astonishing accomplishment. Even today, the most complex full brain for which it has been done is the fruit fly, which has about 140,000 neurons. I've seen a couple of different figures for that, but it's about there. We're nowhere near mapping the nervous system of a human being or any mammal, and we're not going to get there for a long time if we proceed at the rate we're currently going. So, I mean, it took Google about 10 years, I seem to recall, to manage a cubic millimeter of a human brain. Going at that rate, we're talking about billions and billions of years to map a whole human brain. Even if we increase by an order of magnitude, it's still going to be billions of years, right? So it seems to me this claim about mapping the body's neuronal network is a huge over-exaggeration if we're talking about a mapping that is going to illuminate its functioning in such a way that might help to cast light on whether it obeys only physical forces in its causal operation. And you know, I would add even to this that actually I think we're probably going to need to go to a much finer grain than that of neurons if we're not just looking for the distinctive biological functioning of the brain, but we're looking for, even if we're looking for that, but especially if we're trying to work out what physical forces are operational within it. Like a single vesicle within a neuron, a little pouch of neurotransmitter, is already itself a massively mechanically complex system of a sort that we couldn't dream of like accurately mapping out so to predict its behavior with anything like our current methodology. So that doesn't seem promising to me. Now, something else that it occurred to me reading these papers Papineau might have in mind is Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley's Nobel Prize winning research on the electrical changes that occur during a nerve impulse in the giant axon of a squid. And I was pleased to see, actually, maybe he's mentioned this elsewhere, but when he was on Majesty of Reason not long ago, he did refer in passing to Hodgkin and Huxley. So clearly this is part of what he's thinking about. Now, this is another piece of like really fascinating, impressive work where Huxley and Hodgkin, they measure the electrical impulses in this giant neuron from a squid rather than a neuron from a giant squid. And they use this to draw up a mathematical model of ion flows across the neuronal membrane during the build-up of the action potential and the firing, which serves as a really interesting insight into the mechanical properties we can expect of neurons when they are isolated from the rest of the brain and from any non-physical forces that might be operating in a living, animate, conscious being. But as Huxley and Hodgkin are quick to point out in their publication of their research, it goes without saying that they don't mention non-physical forces, but just leaving those aside, all sorts of other physical forces are going to be operational on the neuron when it's situated within a brain. And so this kind of research so far as I can see, just doesn't bear on whether there are non-physical forces operational in the brain of a conscious animate being, any more than the data from physics, which Papineau was so clear about being inconclusive. So, I mean, I really think if you were resting your case on this for causal closure principle, that's completely balmy. I don't think any neuroscientist would say, oh yeah, Huxley and Hodgkin, their work shows that only for fundamental physical forces operate in the brain. They might believe that for other reasons, but they wouldn't show only this. This research shows that. So, all right, what would we need to be able to feel that we did have a robust empirical case for causal closure within the nervous system, which isn't derived from either some kind of general methodological naturalism, which just says, well, until we get evidence otherwise, we're going to assume this, or from some like weak Occamist inference from inanimate matter? Well, it seems that there's a really good question to be asked here, which I think people should take more seriously and try to get precise about. But roughly what we're going to need is live functional data, right, of the patterns of firings of neurons, at least, quite possibly of more fine-grained physical interactions than that in the brain of ideally a living human being, certainly ideally, an animal that we believe to have a conscious mind. Now, in the 1960s, the time at which Papineau is talking about, the most precise procedure for imaging the activity of a living brain was electroencephalography, which had a spatial resolution of, well, it's in the inches cubed, if we're being generous, but it's not even really cubed because it doesn't have very good depth. And it is averaging out the electrical activity of hundreds of thousands of neurons at a time. Even today's fMRI, which is much better, achieves only around a 0.5 millimeter level of resolution. Apologies to US listeners for switching to the metric system there. It's the way I wrote it down. So here we're looking at like 12,500 neurons. To put this in perspective, right, we do now have the static connectome of a fruit fly, which is brilliant and amazing. And interesting. But if a fruit fly flew into an fMRI scanner and stayed still for long enough, it would appear, I mean, probably not even as a single pixel, right? We just wouldn't get any detailed data on how that sophisticated nervous system is working. There are some invasive methods like implanted electrodes that can be more precise in certain ways, but you can't measure large portions of the brain with implanted electrodes. But basically, so far as I can tell, we are a very long way off from getting the kind of data that I took Papineau to imply that we already had in the 50s and 60s, and certainly that I think one would reasonably need to be anything like confident in the causal closure principle within the nervous system on the basis of direct biological evidence, rather than some wider considerations, which you might have. I'd add, like, overconfidence in neuroscience cuts both ways. I just mentioned this in passing. There's a recent, very interesting article by the political scientist Charles Murray arguing in favor of a kind of strong mind-body dualism on the basis of this phenomenon of terminal lucidity, where people regain memory and coherent consciousness in moments before death. And he says, well, there's no way this could be achieved by the brain from what we understand about the deterioration of the brain during dementia and other conditions that in which terminal lucidity has been observed. Interestingly, I mean, I wouldn't dismiss this entirely, but he makes some of exactly the same claims. We've mapped the nervous system, we understand how it operates, and we know the brain couldn't do this. And I think, yeah, there's a tendency for people to recognize that we understand a huge amount about the brain. Like, neuroscience has been really, really impressive. And to allow that to lead them to suppose that therefore we must know most of what there is to know about the brain. And the former is true, but the latter is a long, 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 long way from being true. Making neuroscience, insofar as we need like real fine-grained mechanical detail, at least, not very useful for drawing philosophical conclusions. I think this is the final slide, really. Yeah, okay. So I mean, I've got a bunch more to say about the intersection of this stuff with neuroscience, which is, in a way, where I think the causal closure argument really falls down, but is also very much where opponents of physicalism have failed to offer an illuminating story. So I really think like this is where we should be looking. And I'm open to the idea that we'll have to rethink everything I said so far in a big way, in light of trying to get a coherent big picture theory that is scientifically plausible as well as semantically coherent, ideally. But just a concluding thought about what this tells us about intellectual history. So one thing I think we can see from what I've said about the case for a substantial conscious mind is that ordinary semantic understanding of mental and physical language is probably going to be enough to make it seem very plausible to someone without ulterior motivations that we should think of humans as and other beings like us as composed of mental and physical substances. And I think this might give us a good explanation of why it just so happens that every culture for which we have good data historically and globally has exhibited a version of that view. That's a fact that is occasionally challenged, but is increasingly recognized. So, for example, basically all cultures have practices that sometimes get characterized by anthropologists as ancestor worship, which involve the continued existence of people after bodily death and their interaction with the community, right? This looks, I mean, you put that forward in an analytic philosophy of mind seminar and everyone will say, oh yeah, you're a kind of substance dualist, clearly. Only sometimes anthropologists will try to say, but this isn't substance dualism, or it's not Cartesian dualism, because they want to try to show it's excitingly different from the West. I don't think that's really tenable, at least insofar as the interests of philosophy of mind are concerned. So we've got a good explanation of that. What about the, I think, historically more or less unique rise of materialism in the 20th century? Well, I want to say this, like, it is, let's suppose for the sake of argument that it's debatable whether we have good biological evidence of causal closure. Now, I think we don't, and with the kind of standards that I think both would be needed and that, you know, in some ways Papineau implies we had met, we're not just like hundreds of years, we're at the current rate of science billions of years from getting it. Maybe an AI singularity will speed things up, but at the current rate, we're nowhere near. But suppose that's debatable. I really think we can be super confident that we did not have the kind of evidence for causal closure in the nervous system from biology in the 50s and 60s that would justify, that would vindicate the domination of materialism, physicalism around that time. And I would add that actually the story, the history of ideas story Papineau tells doesn't really work anyway, because there is a revolt against the idea of the immaterial mind, and in particular of dualism, that starts considerably before that time. So people were already talking about the 20th century as the age of the great revolt against dualism in the 1910s. So I think the story doesn't really lie up. Furthermore, on top of that, something one isn't necessarily aware of if you're focused on analytic philosophy of mind, this hostility to dualism, which we've justified with our causal closure argument, can be found in many other disciplines, ranging from ecofeminism to biblical theology, where they have no such grounds officially to reject the idea of immaterial minds, but they are no less firm, to put it nicely, in their dismissal of such an idea. So I think actually it's much, much more plausible that there is some other explanation for why physicalism comes to predominate around the time that it does. I don't think it can be to do with biological evidence of causal closure, because it didn't exist, and people were drawing these conclusions for other reasons. Anyway, why did this happen? I'm really interested in this. I don't claim to know, but just the final thought I want to leave off with is that something we did see, which often gets left out of a story or enters into the story in quite a weird way, in the late 19th and early 20th century, is what historians sometimes refer to as the Great Age of Spiritualism, where, far from scientific progress at that point having led to a move away from the idea of immaterial minds and other spooky things, people were unusually, extraordinarily interested in these ideas. So you had people engaging in seances as social activities. You had the Society of Psychical Research, founded by respected thinkers, one British Prime Minister, really mainstream people taking very, very seriously this stuff. And along with that, I think even people who are interested in parapsychological research today, some of whom I regard as interesting thinkers who I respect, I think we can all recognize there came with this a lot of really silly over-credulousness about the idea of spirits, immaterial minds, a whole bunch of shoddy, putatively scientific work, a certain amount of fraud. And so I want to say, a really good, at least partial explanation for why physicalism becomes dominant when it does, is as a cultural revolt against the Great Age of Spiritualism, a reaction against it, in the way that Romanticism is a reaction against the advances in science and engineering that preceded it. And I would see that as lining up better historically, having greater explanatory value in applying outside of the very small world in which people are talking about causal closure, and as just being a much more human reason for a large-scale trend in opinion than the causal closure argument is able to give us. All right, that's everything I wanted to say, at least at the level of definition, at maximum definition that we could cover. But I'd be very happy to answer any questions or hear your comments on this, Joe.
That was wonderful. I mean, thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Exceptionally clear and very forceful presentation. I guess I'll get your thoughts on one thing and then we can close it out.
Sure.
There's much, much, much more that could be said, of course, right? Who knows? Maybe that's for another conversation for the audience. If you want to see that sort of thing, just let me know in the description. But the way that I see causal closure is, I don't think the evidence is there yet. But in order to maintain a plausible form of dualism, it seems like you're going to want something like interactionist dualism. And if it's a closure violating interactionist dualism, so you don't have systematic overdetermination, which is implausible for various other reasons, you're going to want to have to posit seemingly these fundamental psychophysical laws. And that's starting to make me and others uncomfortable, because these seem to, as Adam Pouts puts it, these just seem to stick out like a sore thumb, right? In nature, they're utterly unlike any other fundamental laws we know of. Every other fundamental law that we know of seems to apply across all of space and time, but the psychophysical laws, they seem to concern matters that are super late in cosmic history, highly local. It's almost as if they're waiting around, waiting for brains to come up so that they can pounce and sprinkle consciousness everywhere. And then not only the uniformity considerations, but also just parsimony considerations. I mean, not only are we positing new fundamental laws, but it seems like the fundamental laws themselves have just this crazy complicated character, right? Because they apply to states of brains, and goodness me, to state that in fundamental terms, we're not just talking about some simple inverse square law or something. These are going to be very difficult to compactly systematize in reasonably fundamental terms, joint carving terms. And so it just looks like this disgusting horde of laws has just invaded our theory And it's like, oh no, I really want to avoid that. So I don't know. I've barfed a bit there, but there's the uniformity considerations and parsimony considerations, which, like, we're not just talking. I mean, come on, like, we're not just talking about, like, oh yeah, Occam's razor. Like, just don't posit new entities. Like, we have got like these fundamental laws which are like hopelessly complicated, it seems. And that's a kind of nomological parsimony, which seems to just cut so much deeper to me than, typical appeals to Occam, where it's like, oh yeah, let's not posit like an additional angel or something.
Yeah. I think it's a really a well-expressed and important point. I basically wanted to say I'm in agreement. I think it's not actually only the laws. Perhaps there's some consolation in this and perhaps not. It's not only the laws that look radically different from what we know in the world of inanimate matter. It is also the nature of the thing related by the laws, i.e. the conscious mind. Why might there be some consolation there? Well, it would seem, less elegant if there's a radically different kind of law relating just the same old kind of thing. If you do already have perhaps the most fundamental threshold in the natural world, or in the world, the empirical world, the contingent world that we know of, in one respect, you might expect other things, other constants to break down in certain ways there. So in some respects, that makes this a worse problem. In some respects, perhaps less so. I want to say, it seems to me plausible that while the official reason for rejecting immaterialism of any kind about the mind is the causal closure argument, this has to do with the fact that this is like a kind of intellectually beautiful, clear argument, whereas I suspect the rational grounds for justified resistance, insofar as they exist, are much more closely attached to the kind of concerns you're raising. And I think these are continuous with the kind of concerns I was gesturing at about where on earth is the immaterial mind meant to fit into our wider understanding of natural history, of the way organisms work. Okay, so another reason maybe why that concern doesn't get emphasized is because it is a matter of weighing up, and proponents of physicalism trying to get somewhere on this, even if just as a kind of adversarial attempt to get at the truth, know very well that those sympathetic to the case against physicalism are going to be willing to put quite a lot of weight on the fact that, well, hang on a moment, here I am undergoing these experiences which couldn't possibly exist in the material world. And it seems like all of the scientific observations that count against this are based on my perspective onto the world as an experiencer. So this just must work out some way. My thinking on this at the moment is like, yeah, I'm one of those people who's going to put fairly maximal weight on those considerations, while absolutely granting that this means I end up with, I think, a world view which is explanatorily vastly more powerful in a more or less non-negotiable respect. It predicts that I am here now experiencing this, whereas I think physicalism, properly understood, predicts that is not so, but which is much less elegant. There's a great temptation to accept a theory which is elegant, even when it has less explanatory power, especially when there's some debate about whether we need to accommodate the thing it doesn't explain. But yeah, so I think it's the right point to end on, because it directs us towards the kind of thinking that needs to be done if we're going to make progress on whether it is really true that a non-physicalist view is viable, rather than merely being more attractive and less vulnerable to the specific causal closure objection that is often taken to be the case.
Okay, well, Ralph, thanks so much for coming on. Audience, again, check links in the description to Ralph's book that we've been talking about, various other papers and work that have come up in our discussion. Check out my Philosophy of Mind playlist, because I've had on Brian Cutter, David Papineau, various other philosophers of mind, and I've covered these topics on my channel. And maybe you guys will be seeing more of this, because I'm going to be doing my dissertation on harmony problems, including psychophysical harmony and various other harmonies involved with psychophysical laws and various other things. So that'll be fun. That's coming up in the future. At the end of this video, I'll also throw in some bonus soccer. I do that occasionally, so that'll come up for you guys. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, smash the like button, turn on that little bell for notifications, and of course, consider supporting me on Patreon. And what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is the Majesty of Reason, and peace out.
What happened? This thing, it fell over, okay? We have to fix this. There, I think that's fixed. Okay, everybody.